Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Mimi Coulter. I am Washington University's Vice Provost and University Librarian, and I'm very pleased to welcome all of you, both those of you here in person and those of you online, who are joining us for this special celebration of our Bound for Beauty exhibition. I'm really excited about this exhibition, not only because it gives us a chance to highlight some of the most beautiful books in our university library's collection, and not just the traditional ones, but also some of our miniatures, which I really always like to see, but also because it's going to give us some insight into book arts, and particularly into the binding process. And we're going to get to look at the decorative techniques that are used to adorn these exciting individually bound books, and really demonstrate the owner's wealth and taste historically. There's really some truly intricate work there. And anyway, I'm very excited about the exhibition. This whole exhibition was organized by Washington University Library's curator of rare books, Cassie Brand, who will be managing our Q&A session later in the program. So please join me in congratulating Cassie and the whole special collections team on what's a fabulous exhibit. I also want to thank Don and Laura Schindler, both alumni of Washington University, for sponsoring the exhibit and the stunning catalog that will soon be making its way to many a coffee table. That catalog is going to be available in the exhibition space after our program. Laura Schindler is a longtime member of the library's National Council, and she and Don have been philanthropically supporting the libraries for years now. So my thanks for that longtime support. It was their hope that we could have a special book celebrating these very special books from our collection. And I want to thank Laura and Don for enabling all of this to happen. So thanks. Okay, so I mentioned my excitement about the exhibit. To lead our presentation today, we have invited book conservator Noah Smutz. Here. Noah is currently the owner of NS Conservation and has worked in this field since 2011 when he started as a student worker at the University of Kansas Library's Conservation Lab. Noah graduated with a master's degree in book conservation from West Dean College in the United Kingdom and has held internships for the Smithsonian Archives and the Bodleian Library, amongst others, and worked as a book conservator for the Smithsonian Libraries. He has been a member of the Institute for Conservation since 2010 and a professional associate since 2019. Today he's going to demonstrate how to bind a book, basically, as well as how to prepare leather for binding and the application of gold tooling. And he's going to do a better job of explaining it than I will. So I'm going to turn it over to him, but please join me in welcoming Noah Smutz.
Thanks so much. Thank you all for being here today. I'm going to give you a brief overview of bookbinding history and why we as humans love decorating books in such elaborate ways. Given its brevity, I will be jumping around a lot and skipping parts of this history and its development. There are many books on these subjects. If you're interested to learn more about any specific items I touch on, please ask after the presentation. I'll be happy to share some places to start. So let us start with the question, what is a book? Most generally, and for the purposes of this exhibit, it's a place knowledge is stored in written form. This can come in many forms, such as clay tablets, scrolls, or codices. For the better part of the last 2,000 years, the dominant form of the book has been the Codex. This is the book you all know, a collection of pages attached together at one side, allowing access to both sides of the leaves and holding them in a set order. A Codex has the advantage of having large flat spaces that can be filled with any sort of decoration. So a little bit of book anatomy before I continue. So we have book here, we have front cover, back cover, or boards, as I may refer to them. There are the decorative end sheets at the front and the back. The top of the book is referred to as the head, the bottom as the tail. This edge is the foredge, and then the spine of the book. To begin with, all books were manuscripts. They were written by hand, and this process generally took a long time and a large investment of resources to complete. So it's not uncommon to see books decorated in all manners of ways to denote their value and expense. And of course, part of that value was the knowledge stored between the covers. That knowledge in and of itself was valuable, so it made sense to cover bindings and jewels and for kings to gift books to other kings. Then printed books come around, and the amount of book production grows exponentially. This is great for the spread of knowledge, but also makes an individual book generally less valuable because that knowledge exists in many other places too, which makes the decoration of those books even more important. This is why over time, the line between repository of knowledge and art object becomes more and more blurred. And it leads to a proliferation in the way books are decorated. This also led to a different way of storing and displaying books. Laying books flat, such as this, horizontally is the best way to store a book for its own well-being. And many modern libraries store their largest books this way, but it does take up a lot of space. So as books began to be produced in higher numbers, it moved to stand them up vertically. But first they were stored foredge out. And this was done, it was a lot easier to write the name of the book on the foredge than it was to write on the leather and have it be visible. And then eventually they flip them around on the shelves the way we know them, spine out, and that leaves all of this real estate for decoration. As books became more common, so did personal libraries among the wealthy. And people in general loved to show off. So it became common not to just have books decorated with blind tooling, which is where impressions are made in the leather, leaving a blind design, and also gold tooling, which is where the same thing is done, but with a layer of gold leaf in between. And then you get, try and hold that steady, you get little designs like this, and it gives it that extra pop. Eventually, collectors would even rebind their collections to match their personal tastes. Henry VIII had his entire collection rebound in red velvet, which makes them easy to identify even today. And some Victorian collectors would group their collections according to subject matter and have them bound in a different color leather for each subject, which is not all that different from today when people organize their library by color and then put a rainbow picture of books on Instagram. All of this book production had a profound impact on bookbinding. If a manuscript took a year and a half or longer to produce, it didn't matter if it took a week or even a month to bind it. But when thousands of books are being printed daily, binding tools and techniques had to catch up. In general, this meant starting to cut corners to produce a product that looked the same and worked similarly, but could be produced much faster. This adaptation in bookbinding for speed is part of what gives me job security as book conservator. At first, book production was sped up by reducing structural integrity of the books, so there would be fewer sewing supports, there would be less time-intensive methods of attaching the boards, and boards stopped being made of wood and were instead made from paper. But eventually, those changes weren't enough, and the quality of the materials used started to lessen as a way to control costs. This also made the decorative process more important because if the book is no longer as robust or made of high-quality materials, it needs to look expensive to keep the price the same. For example, throughout binding history, the thickness of the leather used for bookbinding becomes thinner and thinner, to the point that it looks right, but has no structural integrity. And the multitude of 19th century books with their covers detached is the evidence for this. This corner cutting was part of what led William Morris to explore bookbinding as part of the arts and crafts movement. Many books he printed and had bound were done to a higher standard of craft than was generally carried out at the time, as well as they were extensively decorated. Some of these bindings can be seen in the exhibit. So books hold pages together in a set order. Therefore, how they are attached together is the foundation for the rest of the binding. A modern hardcover book is likely only held together with glue, but for most of its history, the Codex was held together by being sewn before being covered. So here, these are examples of different sewing patterns from different cultures over different centuries used for holding a book together at its base level. Now, the goal of all these styles is the same, which is to help create the mechanical spring that is the spine of the book, which allows it to open and close repeatedly without causing damage. Some styles are more successful than others. Generally, the next step is to attach the covers. And then from there, the spine of the book can further be lined, which will help add additional strength to that mechanical spring. And finally, the covering material is applied. This can be leather, paper, cloth, parchment, or a combination of all those. And this leads us to how those underlying structures create an object that allows for such a variety of decoration. And again, a codex has large flat surfaces, the perfect canvas for all sorts of artistic expressions. And so the first thing I'm going to be demonstrating for you all here today is some leather pairings. So pairing leather is the process of making leather thin enough that it is applicable for covering a book. If you used a full thickness piece of leather on a book, you would end up with book boards that were, the leather would be more than twice as thick as the book board. And so the first process that I will show here, grab some tools, is spoke shaving leather, which this is done using a modified spoke shave, which is a woodworking tool. And this is used to thin leather overall. So an entire piece of leather can be thinned down with this tool. And so, let's see. Okay. Ooh. Sorry about that. And so the blade is moved across the leather, taking a relatively even cut. Or sometimes not. And this can be done over an entire skin to get it to the desired thickness. Now, obviously, it will leave some high spots, some low spots. In that case, you can come in with another type of knife. In this case, this is a historic style Turkish paring knife that I made based off another, one that another conservator had. And so that can be used to very easily shave down those areas of uneven leather. And you can do an entire skin like this by hand. The spoke shave is generally a faster way to do that. And so this is the process, which I will not do the entire piece, as we'd be here much longer than the time allotted to get it to the thinness for bookbinding. But once the piece of leather is at the general thickness that's desired, the next step is to, the next step is paring down the edges, which is done so that when you're turning the leather over the top of a book and down onto the inside and onto the inside of the spine, you don't want there to be a bump from that. You don't want to double the thickness of leather. So your goal is to get the edge as thin as possible. So I'll be showing it on these two pieces of leather here. This is a goat skin, this is a calf skin. These are the two most common leathers you'll see in bookbinding. Goat skin in general is a little bit stronger. The surface is a little bit tougher than calf, but nothing rivals calf for that nice smooth finish. And so we'll start with a little bit of edge paring on the calf. And so this is an English style paring knife with the blade cut at a 45-degree angle. And so usually starting right near the edge, and the goal to start is just to take that corner off. And then coming back and moving deeper into the skin. And again. Oops. Yep. And I went a little too deep there and took part of the grain out. Now, if I stand this up on edge, how visible is that? Yeah. So you can see here at the end, it's a little bit thinner, but there is still, it's thinner than the full thickness, but it's still a decent amount of thickness to it. And so this is where, with this kind of bevel established, you can come back and start taking passes that go deeper into the skin, but are also shallower near the edge, allowing you to thin a larger portion of that out at one time. And so the reason for that, if this side, if we double that up, you can see there's quite a bit of thickness to that leather. Whereas where I've been working down here, if we double that up, it almost disappears. And that's really the goal. If you flip the leather over and you can feel a ridge where that is, you haven't gone thin enough with it. And so the goal then is to get that nice and thin so that it won't be felt under the leather on the spine of a book. And so this is the calf skin, which calf also, I find, tends not to pair quite as nice as goat does. Most bookbinders prefer working with goat skin for that and a number of other reasons. And so same process with goat, taking several passes. To work back towards that desired thickness. And this does leave a bit of a shelf right there where it goes from full thickness to starting down that bevel. And that's where you can come back with, usually a curved knife works well and can work right along that transition to eliminate that step. And again, it's all, the main reason for all this pairing being done is it is so that when you are doubling up the thickness of leather along the spine and places like that, it doesn't show through on the final binding. And another place that it can be important is if you have a book with raised bands like this, if you had the full thickness of leather, you're not going to see much of a bump over those unless they're very tall. And so that's another place where you would thin the leather specifically where the raised bands are going to be. And you can, some people will just work with a curved knife, which I can sort of do, but it has never been my my preferred method of leather pairing. I prefer working with the straight English style knife, probably not surprising given that's where I did my studies and learned how to do this. But that's the process that takes a while, obviously, to go around the full piece of leather that you're going to be applying to the book. And so from here, I will jump to, once you have the leather on the book, then obviously you have to do the finishing, which is done more modernly in gold foil, that's an adhesive backed foil, or historically with gold leaf applied to the leather. So we'll start by taking a look at some gold foil. So this comes in a 2-inch roll. It has a heat set adhesive on the back of it, and the pressure of the brass tool will, and the heat will adhere it where you want it and not where you don't, so that it will pull up off of there. So I need to cool the tool down a little bit. Got them a little too hot. Okay, so once you have the tool to the right heat, which the foil is rated somewhere right around the boiling point of water is where you want the tool at for stamping with it. And so the tool is generally held with a thumb on top, and that's so you can push down with it. And then once I have it on the leather, I'll want to rock it kind of in a north, south, east, west direction, just to make sure the impression is even across the tooling. So I apologize, this is not at all that visible on the camera. So I'm just stamping it in the middle here. Obviously, if this were the cover of a book, I would be making sure it was centered, having lines drawn out, all of those pieces. And so I'll find that bottom line, and then I can stand the tool up, press down, rock the tool, and then does that. So that gives me the impression. I'm not going to pull the foil up yet until I do a few more items on there. And so there are tools like that that hold brass type, which are used for tooling. There are also tools, this is a pallet, which has a double line on it, which can be used in this case. And some bookbinders have a little bit longer fingernails than I do, and will use their fingernail as a guide for the tool so they don't burn their fingers. Mine aren't long enough, so I use a little leather cover on my finger. And so I'm sighting down the tool. There. Trying to make sure I'm nice and straight, and then roll the tool across the surface. And then there are also these smaller tools that have individual decorations on them. And so then kind of a north, south, east, west rocking, and making sure not to move the tool from the initial impression, or you get a double stamp that way. And I'm just gonna go through all the tools on here, and then we'll move over to the gold. And this is another palette that has I don't know if that shows up well. It's a wider design. And these palettes are also useful if you are working on the curve of a spine, the curvature that the tool itself has, just a slight curve, works very well for rolling over the spine. One last little tool here. Then we can take the entire piece of gold foil. See how well we did. And so when stamping through foil by hand, the foil is formulated to be stamped with a stamping press that generates tons of pressure. And so the pressure is enough that the brass tool will cut all the way through the foil, usually leaving a little bit of a crisper impression. In this case, you can see in the words where it left some pieces behind of the foil, but usually loose pieces of foil can be pulled out. Either this is just a crepe eraser that can be used, or going in, if it's just some really small things, going in with tweezers can also be a good way. And let's see, relatively square. And so that's what foil tooling is. So there's not too much prep work there in how you're setting that up. It's really having the tools, getting them to the right temperature, laying your foil out, and knowing the design you're aiming for. Then with gold tooling, so I'll give a little preview of what, this is the point where we're at to start with. But before we start tooling, to get to this point, which I did yesterday because I am not confident enough to be manipulating thin pieces of gold leaf in front of the entire room. But to do so, you use a gold cushion, which is a leather cushion that you work really hard not to touch the surface of, because you don't want any oils from your hands. If there's any oil, that's what the gold will stick to. And this is then a gold knife. So the only use for this knife is for cutting the gold once it's on the foil. Now, there are several ways to pick up a piece of gold foil. Obviously, you need something a little oily to be able to hold on to it. Some people will use something like a cotton pad with a little bit of Vaseline on it as a way to manipulate it. You can also get a gilding brush, which is made from squirrel hair, as a way to manipulate it. And gold leaf itself comes in these small squares in these books of 20. It's been a while since I bought a book, so I don't remember exactly how many pieces come in, but I think it's about 20. And gold leaf is made by essentially beating gold sheet incredibly thin. And so if I were going to use this, I would flip the book over to lay the gold out onto the cushion. I could then use the knife to cut it into strips, which is what I did with the piece we'll be using, and then can use the squirrel brush to pick up a small piece. And then for the preparation of the leather, to start with, I used a thin wheat starch paste, which is just wheat starch cooked in water to make an adhesive, and that's painted over the entire surface of the leather to kind of give a general background. Then there is an adhesive called Glare that is used, which modernly can be shellac based, historically could be egg white based, and that is in a few different layers, is painted over the leather and allowed to dry. And then the last step before putting the gold on the leather that I do is putting a thin layer of Vaseline across all of the leather, because that gives the gold something to stick to, so that when I transfer it over with the brush, it will just grab onto the leather and hold there. So I have to make sure I place it right, or, you get little bits over here and over here and over here that, go where they want. And so now we can move on to tooling for this. So it's a similar process. And this is a little pad, cotton pad that I've soaked in water that I'm using to cool the tool down. And so it's really kind of going by the sound of the sizzle for getting it to the right temperature, which is something that gets shown to you, and then you mess it up a lot of times before figuring out what that correct sound is. And then the final test you can do is I'll lick my finger and can kind of touch it off on the tool. And if it just evaporates, then I know that I'm at the right place. With this tool, I don't have to do as much east-west manipulation because it is so wide that it has a pretty solid base to it. All right, then flip this sideways. And I'm just kind of doing a similar design to what I did with the foil stamping. And this little triangular piece, it's useful because it can be used in this way kind of as a highlight below the text, but it can also be used in the corners. So you could do corner pieces with it, which sometimes you'll see that on spines. It'll be a square panel that'll have the four corners and then a centerpiece decorating it. Let's see. Be a little more decorative with this one this time. All right, so that gives us that panel done. And there are a number of ways to remove the excess gold. Some people will use a gold rubber, which is generally something like a crepe eraser placed in turpentine until it dissolves, and then it kind of becomes a gummy mass. And the point of using something like that is you can then, you use that over and over until it's full of gold, and then you can take it to a goldsmith or a watchmaker or something and have them melt it down and pay you for the weight of gold that's still there, so that you're not wasting all of the gold leaf. In this case, I'm using a kneaded eraser, which also picks it up well. And so start. And it's being a little more stubborn and sticking to the leather because I prepped this yesterday. But the other way to remove this, well, the historic way of 20th century binders that my tutor learned and told me about was to use liquid benzene as a way to remove it, which is a highly toxic chemical. And as he told us this story, he said, "It's amazing I don't have cancer." And and the more modern way to do that is to use lighter fluid, which will that'll get the Vaseline off. It will also get the glare off and everything. But given this presentation is taking place inside a library, inside special collections, I didn't think it was a good idea to bring lighter fluid into the building. And so this is the process of gold tooling. Obviously, it can be done in much more elaborate and decorative ways. I have known binders that will have tracing paper where they have drawn the entire design out before they start. You can also do several layers of gold to really get a depth to the lettering that I've seen done. And so this is really just the very bare bones basic way of, it's using brass or bronze tools, heated up, and then stamping through the gold. And so with that, do we have any questions?
Thank you so much. I will be taking questions both from our Zoom audience and from our in-person audience. For those of you on Zoom, please use the Q&A function down at the bottom of your Zoom window. And for those of you in person, I'll be repeating the questions so that people on Zoom can hear them. Would anybody like to start? Yes.
You said you made the curved knight based on.
Yes. Yes.
So he's asking that about the curved knight made based on a model.
So while I was in grad school at Westing, Westing has 5 conservation programs: books, clocks, ceramics, metals, and furniture. And so taking advantage of the friendships I had with people in the furniture lab and the metals lab, I was able to work with them, and I have made all these knives were knives I made in grad school. And part of that was I really enjoyed the process, it was fun, but also it was making your own tools is really a way to, you never understand a tool better than if you've made it. And so these were made, this was made from stock metal, cut and shaped, and then one of my metals conservator friends helped me harden and heat treat it, and then one of the furniture conservator friends turned the knob for me and helped me get it all attached together. So it was definitely a group collaboration, but I'm the one that ends up with the result. So.
We have a question from Zoom. Is gilt similarly applied to the head, tail, and foredge, i.e. gold leaf heat pressed against the edge?
So for applying it to the edges of a book, it's a different process in that you will have the book in a press. Usually the boards at that point are likely attached but have been shifted out of the way, and you clamp the book, because obviously a book being made from paper, if you clamp it tight enough, it is essentially a piece of wood. And so then you sand it to an incredibly fine finish. And then there are a variety of materials you apply before you eventually apply the gold leaf to the top, and then you burnish that in with an agate burnisher. And then once you open the pages, it just stays stuck to the edges. So similar, but a little bit different.
Could you talk a little bit about the sewing structures that you showed?
Yeah.
He's been asked to talk a little bit about the sewing structures that he showed at the beginning of the presentation.
All right, so I have these 5 sewing structures here. These 3 count as unsupported because these 2 count as unsupported because there is not a sewing support underneath the thread. And these are kind of the earliest types of sewing you see in books. So the Codex, early 200 to 400 AD. This is an unsupported link stitch. This is the type of sewing you would see. And so the difference between these 2, this one is done by you're chasing the thread all the way back and forth in each gathering to sew them together. Whereas this book, the way this type of sewing is done, you have one piece of thread that is linked between these 2 stations and another piece between these 2, and you use 2 needles to sew that style. Then these 3 are supported sewings, and these are going kind of chronologically oldest to newest. This is an interesting one that is seen in bindings from 1000 to 1100. It's an interesting one because each sewing support is sewn separately with this very intricate pattern to weave the thread together and lock it into place, but it results in a very strong sewing structure that gives a pretty nice, a nice round spine because of how supported it is. And then the more common sewing that you see kind of from 1000 to 1600 would be this double cord. So this is using linen cords and fully wrapped with the thread as sewing. And then this is a link stitch sewing. So it's linked all the way along. The looping of the thread together is called a French knot. I don't remember why. And it is done, and then it's done over flat linen tapes. And this is a sewing style developed in the mostly in the 19th century. Oh, and let me show one other piece I forgot to. Let's take a look at. So we have the foil stamped, and let me set that next to the gold, because personally, I think you can just see how much warmer actual gold is in the stamping versus the foil. And you can get different color, you can get a rainbow of colors in foils, but none of the golds ever quite match actual gold. And this is a 23 karat gold leaf.
Can you tell us about the apron you're wearing? Somebody's impressed about how many tools you have.
Yes, so this apron is made by a small company based out of Ohio, Leather by Dragonfly, and they make custom leather aprons to your specifications. So I did a 1-hour video chat with them with a template apron showing them exactly where I wanted all my tools. And 4 months later, this apron showed up. So it's a relatively new addition to the tool bag, but one I'm very happy about.
The question is there a reason for the squirrel hair as opposed to other animals?
As I understand it, and I don't claim to be an expert on why different brushes are made with different animal hairs, but the squirrel hair, it is the length that you can have, but the strength and flexibility that it holds that make it really good, and it's very fine at the ends, which are really what you want for just, it makes the barest of contact with the gold, because if it had too much surface area at the end, when you picked up the gold with it and went to put it down, it would stay stuck to the brush instead of separating onto the leather surface.
Why else do bookbinders and or conservators prefer goat leather besides the pairing mentioned earlier?
So goat leather versus calf. From a strength perspective, goat is generally a bit stronger than the calf leather, which as a conservator, I really like that for long lasting. It also, with the calf, like on this piece, if I just take my fingernail, I can make a pretty indelible mark that will not go away, versus on the goat, it makes a little bit of a mark, but a little bit of rubbing and that's gone. Whereas on the calf, it stays. So it's both the appearance of it, as well as the grain layer, the mechanical structure at a microscopic level of the two. This grain layer is not as well attached to the underlying structures, and so it's much more likely over time that you'll lose the grain layer on calf than on goat.
Paper has a grain direction. Does leather have a grain direction?
If you'll allow me to repeat,
Okay, sorry.
the question is that paper has a grain direction. Does leather also have a grain direction?
In my experience with leather, it's more the further you get from the spine of where the spine of the animal was, especially you get to the leather that was around the stomach and things, there's a lot more movement there, it's a lot stretchier, and that ends up being both for pairing and application. You can start with a piece that might be this big, but by the time you paired it and you put pressure against it, maybe it's this big as it stretches out. And so it's, in my experience, it's more that, the closer you are to the edges of the skin, the stretchier the leather is going to be for a specific grain. I honestly not remembering if there is a distinct grain to the leather.
I was just going to ask about the other types of leathers that might get used in pros and cons. Cheap.
Yeah.
So asking about various other types of leathers that might be available with pros and cons, and whether or not he wants to talk about vellum.
So we'll start with the leathers. Some other common leathers that you do see in bookbinding, you do see sheep, you see pig, other types of leather that you can get but aren't as common given their origin are things like kangaroo. So starting with sheep leather, you can use sheep. It is similar to calf, though the way that the fat layers are structured in sheepskin, essentially they create perfect layers inside that, which means the layers very easily peel apart and delaminate. So you see a lot of sheep, you also see a lot of damage to sheepskin historically because it was cheaper and more available. Pigskin is, if you, and I know there's one in the exhibit, but if you think of like 14th, 15th century big bindings with wooden boards that are white to off-white and have metal furniture and are blind tooled, that's generally on an alum-tawed pigskin. Alum tawing versus tanning, it's a slightly different chemical process for producing the leather that can lead to more strength from the pigskin. There's also a much more pronounced grain in the pigskin. One of the reasons you don't see pigskin used as much anymore is because crackling is made from pigskin. And lots of people prefer to eat that rather than use the skin to make leather. And then kangaroo leather is, I have never tried to bind anything with kangaroo leather. I know it is regarded as one of the strongest leathers in the world. It's what most, the Indiana Jones whips in the movie, those are all made out of kangaroo leather because that's one of the main applications for it. And then something like cow skin, the reason we use calf being a younger cow, it's a thinner leather, it's a smoother surface because like this apron is cow skin. And once you get up, you get a lot more grain as well as the thickness of the leather is, you would be having to take so much away, you would lose so much time working with that. And then vellum, which is untanned animal skin that is stretched wet on a frame. And the stretching process, once it dries, changes it mechanically so that it won't rot. And vellum, you can bind a book in vellum. It is challenging. Vellum doesn't like to fold, as well as vellum, it remembers the shape of the animal and it's always trying to go back to that shape. So it will move a lot on you. So if you do have a vellum binding, you generally need to have a box that restrains the movement of it so that the covers don't just splay open and things like that. So another option and one you do see historically.
Tangentially, have you ever worked with non-animal leathers like mushroom leathers or vegan leathers? Do you ever get that request with your work?
Do you ever get requests for people to work with, or for you to work with vegan leathers like mushroom or those types of things?
I have not gotten the request to work with vegan leathers. My hesitancy towards that would be a lot of those are mushroom based, a lot are plastic based, and I don't trust plastics to last any length of time compared to the natural materials. But there is a line of thought in conservation that is uncertain about the longevity of leather. There is a way to using layers of Japanese paper built up with thickened acrylic paint to create kind of a conservation grade facsimile of leather that I find can be really nice if you needed to, let's say, patch a small area can work well. I worry about its structural strength in the long run over a joint where it's constantly flexing.
Do you recycle the leftover pieces of gold leaf?
So usually with gold leaf, if I had a gold rubber ready to use, I would have used that to pick it up because then eventually, yeah, you can just take that and sell that to a jeweler or goldsmith, and they'll melt it down and give you the price that's the weight of the gold that's there as a way to recoup that. And similar things can be done with, a kneaded eraser, which is what I'm using here, though that's a little more toxic to light on fire.
I just want to say thank you for not setting fire inside the library.
Yes, I didn't think I'd be invited back if I brought lighter fluid.
No, and I think I would
Especially-
have gotten in trouble for inviting you in the first
Especially
place.
if I was working with the lighter fluid here and the hot plate's 3 feet away.
Yes, absolutely. An anonymous question. Have you ever run into anyone requesting repairs on books bound with anthropodermic bibliophagy, also known as human skin, or have you ever worked with human skin bindings?
I have not. I know they exist. I have not seen one in person. A number of there are a number of libraries that hold them, though they don't generally like to advertise that fact. But you see it especially on medical texts, as they were working with cadavers and they figured, why waste it? And so you get a lot of books made from cadaver skin that way. Not a lot, I should say. There's not many books actually bound in human skin, but it does, when they do turn up as something that was forgotten about, it does tend to make the news, because obviously that's something familiar to us all. Yes.
What's the oldest codex that you've ever worked with, and are you nervous working with particularly old ones? Do you always do a complete? You hinted that there's repairs and not just a full rebinding. How do you make that call?
Unmute. There we go. Okay. Couple of questions. Make sure I get these right for you. What's the oldest codex you've ever worked with? Do you get nervous when working with a lot of the older books? And how do you make the decision whether or not you do a full rebind versus a repair? Did I get that? Okay.
Okay, so oldest book I've gotten to work with, the text itself was a Hebrew manuscript written in 1342. This was part of the Baldin Library's collection when I was interning there. Sadly, it had been put in a 19th century binding, and I was preparing the 19th century binding, so I didn't get to actually work on the manuscript itself. But that's the oldest I've worked on. And then, remind me, second question.
How do you?
Oh, yes, working on things like that. So there can be nerves, though the more you do it, the less nerves there are. You're also in the business of fixing books, so if you do make a mistake, as long as it's not bad, you can always fix it. I will say one of my most nerve-wracking days was during that internship in Oxford, and we were measuring books that were going to go on exhibit, and it was for their new treasures gallery. And so as the intern, they hand me the spreadsheet, tell me to go get the boxes off the cart and bring them back. And so I go get the first one and bring it back and open it up, and there's Shakespeare's first folio. And this is my second day interning. I'm a professional here, keep it together. And then the second book was a translation of something by King Alfred from 890, I think. So yeah, so that was a day spent with those books makes everything else seem not as stressful, I would say. And then, so for deciding how to repair a book, so generally in conservation, conservation tries to follow the ideal of minimal intervention to achieve the goal. And so in trying to repair it, you want to keep as much of the original material as you can. One of the oddities of books, which is also the same with cars and clocks, is that when they're conserved, they need to work again. Versus like a chair in a museum, it might have a loss out of a leg that they fill in and make it look correct, but it might be just filled with like a bulked resin epoxy, so that there's no actual structural strength to that. You can't sit in the chair anymore. It's just an object on display. Whereas with a book, if I give it back to a client, they can't open it. That doesn't make them very happy. And so it's that balancing act of, you want to try and keep as much of the original material as you can, as well as make it work so there's access to that information inside the book again.
There are some rare book collections around town, such as, I think it's the Malincrot Library, the Monsanto Library, and the Botanical Garden.
Mm-hmm.
And if you are familiar with those, how would you comment or rate on their conservation?
Well, we have the conservator from the Botanical Garden sitting in the front row.
So the question was about some private libraries around town, and asking Noah to comment on their conservation with, of course, Susie from Mobot right here in the room.
You know, I would say in general, all of the libraries that I have dealt with here in town, their number one goal is to ensure the survivability of their collection as long as they can with the resources they have. And so everybody is very much dedicated to keeping those collections around, and the level to which they staff for that or bring in someone like me to do outside work for that, it really just depends on the the finances of that institution, as well as what the priorities at the time are. Any library here in town like that, they're going to have things in climate controlled storage, and that's really, for the longevity of collections, is the biggest thing you can do for their survival.
How common would you say it is for people to request bespoke covers for their personal collections now, or are your clients typically universities and academics?
So my clients are split around 50-50, sometimes 60-40 either way, depending on the year, of private individuals or university libraries, museums, things like that. And a lot of those individuals, it's a lot of family Bibles. You can think of the big ones from the late 19th century. Those come to me quite a bit. And the value to those isn't so much the addition of the Bible. It was, those Bibles were generally made as quickly and cheaply as possible. And so they have the issues that things like that have. But the value to the people is that usually there are the family pages that record marriages, births, deaths, and that's really the value to them, to get that, to have that Bible put back into usable shape. So if they want to, they could take it off the shelf and open it and look at those pages, instead of leaving it in the garage or the basement or the attic for the last 30 years, being too scared to touch it.
How does the type of fiber use, whether it's rag, cotton, or wood fiber, how does that influence the materials you use?
Yeah.
So
Oh, sorry.
that's okay. How do the plant fibers or different fibers used for making the paper influence how you might bind the book? Did I get that?
So the differences, so we'll start in the Western world first, which is paper in the West is initially made out of a lot of rags. So it's actually a lot of hemp and linen originally, before cotton was introduced. And those papers are beautiful. You can open a book from the 1400s and the paper is still a lovely creamy off-white and great to turn. And that continues up until, with some changes in paper formulation, up until the 1820s, 1830s, industrial period, when they started making paper out of wood pulp because it was cheap and fast and easy, but they didn't pull the lignin out of it, which makes paper very acidic, which is why from about 1820, 1830 up to about 1970, that's why that paper turns brown, why it is so brittle, why it breaks so easily, because of the lignin in there that makes it fall apart. And then for Eastern papers, most conservators use Eastern papers in their repairs. So the Kozo, the paper mulberry, which for Japanese papers, the way that Eastern papers are produced versus Western papers, the fibers are not as not pounded to the same level, essentially. So they're left more intact, which what you end up with is a paper that can be significantly thinner than a Western paper, but equally as strong as Western papers. And so for repairing Eastern papers, I would always use an Eastern paper, but even for Western papers, I will, because I can use much lighter paper then. And in some cases, if I'm having to repair over text, I can use something that's along the lines of 5 or 6 grams per square meter of the paper that is strong enough to hold a repair, to repair a tear over text, but you can still read the text through it. So it's really a combination of those things.
Okay, we have time for one last question. Okay, then please join me in thanking Noah again. Before I let you all go, I want to let you know about some upcoming virtual events. On Tuesday, April 26th, we'll have a data users group on R. On the 27th, we are going to have a special Preservation Week virtual book club that is actually going to be hosted by our Director of Preservation, and she will be talking about the flood in Venice and how to manage disasters. And then on Wednesday, April 27th, right afterward, we're going to have a faculty book talk.